In Book 2, Chapter 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle makes 4 points that are important for us. First, he notes that the purpose of ethics is to become a good person. Second, he notes that virtuous action can only be described in outline. Third, he notes that virtuous action is corrupted by excess and by deficiency. And lastly, he notes that the same activities that build a virtue also flow from the virtue once we have it. The chapter begins. The branch of philosophy we are dealing with at present is not purely theoretical like the others, because it is not in order to acquire knowledge that we are considering what virtue is, but to become good people. Otherwise there would be no point in it. So we must consider the matter of our actions, and in particular how they should be performed, since, as we have said, they are responsible for our states developing in one way or another.
Okay, let's pause right here in the text and think about what Aristotle has just said. He said that our aim in this study is not to acquire knowledge of virtue, but to become good people, to become virtuous people. So I'd like you to think about the power of the distinction he's making here. What's the difference between knowing what virtue is, or having knowledge of, say, honesty or courage, and actually becoming and being an honest or a courageous or a good person? What is somebody missing if they only have this intellectual understanding of the virtue, but they don't live it out? They're not able to conform their entire life, including their emotions and their desires, to this intellectual knowledge. We might think of a person who knows what honesty is, or who knows, I know that I shouldn't steal, but when I'm in the situation, my desires say, why don't you just go ahead and take that? And notice we have this psychological conflict that Plato also noted in the divided soul, where the intellect says one thing, reason says one thing, and for Plato, it's the appetite or the spirit that says something else. For Aristotle, with his animal part of the soul, this middle part of the soul, it's much more as though the part of the soul that is represented maybe more as like a dog or a horse is not trained well to obey the findings of reason. So I'd like you to think up some examples of what it might be like for a person to have knowledge of virtue, but to not be a good or virtuous person. You can use courage or honesty as your example. You may have some stories from your own life that you could draw on in composing these. If not, think up some creative examples, and we'll talk about these soon. Now, back to the text.
The idea of acting in accordance with right reason is a generally accepted one. Let us here take it for granted. We shall discuss it later, both what right reason is and how it is related to the other virtues. But this we must agree on before we begin, that the whole account of what is to be done ought to be given roughly and in outline. As we said at the start, the accounts we demand should be appropriate to their subject matter, and the spheres of action and what is good for us, like those of health, have nothing fixed about them.
So Aristotle says here that virtuous action can be described only generally and in outline, not exactly. And a lot of people reading this, I think, come to the wrong conclusion that for Aristotle then, there must be no correct answer about virtuous action or ethics, that it must be somehow ultimately arbitrary. You can just make up your own mind. But he hasn't said quite that. He didn't say that there is no right answer about ethics. He said the answer cannot be specified exactly. We can only give a sort of broad brush outline of what virtuous behavior is. And the reason for this is that virtue is a subject that deals with specific circumstances of a wide variety of people, and the huge diversity of situations in the human race is going to mean that we are not going to be able to give an exact formula for being courageous that will apply to every situation. So I can't give you a list of situations under which you should face danger and a list of situations under which you should flee. What I can do is orient you toward making a good, prudent evaluation of when it's correct to fight and when it's correct to flee, given certain kinds of dangers. That good sense of good judgment would really be the virtue of courage, then, for you. It doesn't mean there's no such thing as courage, or that courage is whatever anybody wants it to be. It means that courage is the kind of thing that can't be specified in advance in an exact formulaic type of way. So I can't give you an exact recipe for virtue or for happiness. What I can do is describe generally and in outline what a particular virtue or what virtue in general is like. He notes that this follows from our previous observation that we should expect the level of precision in any science that is appropriate to its subject matter. And since ethics is a science of human life and all of its vagaries and different circumstances, we're going to have a level of precision that is appropriate to that amount of diversity in our different circumstances and life experiences. I think one helpful comparison for this is to think of the reality of the human diet, right? We all are familiar with watching what we eat, and for some people, a high-calorie diet or a high-protein diet is exactly what they need. For other people, that would be disastrous. Other people need more calories or fewer. Pregnant women need a highly specific diet. So if somebody comes and says, give me an exact formula for precisely what kind of diet human beings require, we would give, I think, just the same answer that Aristotle gives here. Human diets are varied enough that while I can give you a general outline, approximately 2,000 calories a day for an active person under usual circumstances, I can't give you an exact formula that will apply to every single person at all places and times. Ethics and virtue is going to be much like diet in that case. Now, let's go back to the text.
First, then, let us consider this, the fact that states like this are naturally corrupted by deficiency and excess, as we see in the cases of strength and health. We must use clear examples to illustrate the unclear, for both too much exercise and too little ruin one's strength, and likewise too much food and drink and too little ruin one's health, while the right amount produces, increases, and preserves it. The same goes then for temperance, courage, and the other virtues. The person who avoids and fears everything, never standing his ground, becomes cowardly, while he who fears nothing but confronts every danger becomes rash. In the same way, the person who enjoys every pleasure and never restrains himself becomes intemperate, while he who avoids all pleasure, as boors do, becomes, as it were, insensible. Temperance and courage, then, are ruined by excess and deficiency, and preserved by the mean.
Aristotle notes here that virtuous action is going to be corrupted by excess and by deficiency, and he compares virtue again to strength. Too much food and exercise will ruin your strength as well as too little. The same is going to be true of the virtues. Facing danger recklessly is just as hazardous to being a good, courageous person as is fleeing from every danger. So when we look at virtues, we're going to find what Aristotle will call the golden mean, or what's traditionally called the golden mean. We look for the middle path between doing too much and doing too little. Too much honesty, too little honesty. Too much courage or bravery in the face of danger, and too little. Too much indulgence in sensual pleasure, and too little indulgence in sensual pleasure. So it's always going to be a matter of finding the middle path for Aristotle. That's where we're going to find the virtue in any particular case.
Not only are virtues produced and developed from the same origins and by the same means as those from which and by which they are corrupted, but the activities that flow from them will consist in the same things. For this is also true in other more obvious cases, like that of strength. It is produced by eating a great deal and going through a great deal of strenuous exercise. And it is the strong person who will be most able to do these very things. The same applies to virtues. By abstaining from pleasures, we become temperate, and having become so, we are most able to abstain from them. Similarly with courage. By becoming habituated to make light of what is fearful and to face up to it, we become courageous, and when we are courageous, we shall most be able to face up to it.
One of the last points that Aristotle makes in this chapter, then, is that once we have acquired a virtue, the same activities that helped us to develop the virtue also represent the exercise of the virtue. They flow from the virtue once we have it. So the activities that lead to my becoming courageous, my facing danger, also make me better able to face danger in the future. And the comparison to strength again here holds, that it's the same activities, exercising, that allow me to become strong, that then are the activities that I'm able better to do once I have become strong. That's it for Chapter 2 of Book 2. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.